In 1976, a mysterious pneumonia killed dozens in Philadelphia. It was immune to every antibiotic. Doctors were helpless. The CDC hunted for an invisible killer, fearing a national pandemic. But the source wasn't a foreign virus or a secret weapon. It was an undiscovered species of bacteria, hiding in the most unexpected place: the hotel's air conditioning system. How did a modern comfort become a deadly weapon? And what other dangers are hiding in plain sight? The summer of 1976 was a season of celebration. America was 200 years old, and in Philadelphia, the heart of the nation's birth, the party was in full swing. Inside the grand ballroom of the Bellevue-Stratford Hotel, the air was thick with cigarette smoke, patriotic fervor, and the smell of spilled beer. It was the 58th annual convention of the American Legion of Pennsylvania, and the men gathered were in high spirits. They were veterans, survivors of foreign wars and the Great Depression, now comfortable in their middle and old age, their uniforms still crisp, their hats worn at a jaunty angle. At a table near the stage, Ray Miller, a retired Air Force captain with a booming laugh and a chest full of ribbons, was leading a boisterous, off-key rendition of a wartime song. He was 61 years old, but had the energy of a man half his age. He raised his glass, his face flushed with joy and camaraderie. In the middle of a note, a dry, ticklish cough caught in his throat. He paused, cleared his throat, and dismissed it with a long drink of ice water from the pitcher on the table. It was nothing. A tickle from the smoke-filled room. He threw his head back and rejoined the song, his voice once again the loudest at the table, completely unaware of the invisible enemy that had just taken root deep inside his lungs. A few days later, the songs were gone. Ray Miller lay in a bed at a small hospital in his hometown, his body burning with a fever of 105 degrees. His skin was pale and clammy, his breath a ragged, wet sound, a desperate, losing battle for air. He was a strong man, a man who had survived a tour in the Pacific, but he was being defeated by an enemy he couldn't see. His terrified wife stood by the bedside, clutching his hand. A doctor, his face etched with worry and confusion, stood in the doorway, talking to her in low tones. "I don't understand it," the doctor said, gesturing to an X-ray clipped to a lightbox on the wall. The image showed a pair of lungs that were almost completely white, clouded over by a savage, galloping pneumonia. "We've given him penicillin, tetracycline, every antibiotic we have. Nothing is touching it. It's as if the bacteria, whatever it is completely resistant to everything." As he spoke, the phone at the nurse's station began to ring. A nurse answered, listened for a moment, her expression growing grim. She put the caller on hold and turned to the doctor. "It's Dr. Abrams from the ER," she said, her voice tight. "He has another one, a man from Bloomsburg. Same symptoms, same high fever, same pneumonia. He was in Philadelphia last week, at the American Legion convention." The Dr. S face went pale. This wasn't just one sick man. This was a pattern. This was an outbreak. The red telephone on Dr. David Rosenthal S desk at the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta had a special jarring ring. It was a direct line, reserved for the kinds of calls that became the first chapter in medical history books. When it rang that morning, Rosenthal, a calm, focused epidemiologist in his 40s, answered it with the methodical composure of a man who had hunted the world's deadliest diseases. He listened intently, his expression slowly hardening into one of grim focus. On the other end of the line, the director of the CDC was reading the latest numbers from the Pennsylvania Department of Health. 20 confirmed cases, 6 dead, all men. All had attended the same convention in Philadelphia, and all of them were dying from a strange, fulminant pneumonia that was defying all treatment. Rosenthal swiveled in his chair and pulled down a large map of Pennsylvania that hung on his wall. As the director continued to speak, Rosenthal began to make small marks on the map with a grease pencil, a constellation of sickness and death that was spreading across the state. He knew what this was. When a group of people from different towns and cities all get sick with the same mysterious illness after gathering in one place, it means the contagion is spreading. This was not a local problem anymore. It was a national emergency. It was the start of something terrible. The Philadelphia Department of Health was in a state of controlled chaos. Phones rang incessantly, their shrill alarms a constant soundtrack to the mounting crisis. Reporters, smelling the biggest public health story of the decade, shouted questions in the hallways. Into this whirlwind walked Dr. Rosenthal and his small team from the Epidemic Intelligence Service. They were the cavalry, the world's foremost disease detectives, but to the local officials, they looked like an occupying army. They were met by Frank D'Amico, a senior official in the state health department. He was a career bureaucrat, a political animal whose first instinct was to control the narrative. He saw the CDC's arrival not as a welcome relief, but as a federal indictment of his own department's failure. "We have this under control, Doctor," D'Amico insisted, shaking Rosenthal's hand with a grip that was a little too firm. "We think it is a localized flu outbreak. We're handling it." As the words left his mouth, an aide hurried over and handed D'Amico a slip of paper. He glanced at it, and the color drained from his face. It was a new report from the coroner's office. The death toll had just jumped from 6 to 11. Rosenthal saw the look on D'Amico's face. He knew the man was in over his head. "Mr. D'Amico," Rosenthal said, his voice calm but firm. "With all due respect, this is no longer a local matter. We need your full cooperation. We need lists of every convention attendee, every hotel employee. We need access to the victim's medical records. And we need it now." The clash was immediate. The careful, methodical pursuit of scientific truth had just slammed into a wall of politics, bureaucracy, and a desperate, frightened man's professional pride. The race to find the invisible killer had begun. Dr. David Rosenthal's team commandeered a large conference room in the Philadelphia Department of Health and transformed it into the nerve center of the investigation. It became their war room. Within hours, the pristine walls were completely covered in vast sheets of paper, a massive hand-drawn grid that was the single most powerful tool in epidemiology. The line listing chart. The name of every known victim was written down the left-hand side. Across the top, stretching for 20 feet, were hundreds of columns, each representing a single data point. Age, hometown, pre-existing medical conditions, which day they arrived in Philadelphia, their hotel room number. Did they eat the hot dogs at the street vendor on Tuesday? Did they use the ice machine on the 3rd floor? Did they attend the prayer breakfast on Wednesday morning? The room was a hive of controlled, urgent activity. A half-dozen young epidemiologists from the EIS, the Epidemic Intelligence Service, worked the phones relentlessly. Their voices were a low, constant murmur, a blend of scientific precision and gentle empathy as they spoke to grieving widows, terrified survivors, and confused family members. "Yes, ma'am, I know this is difficult, but can you remember if your husband drank tap water or bottled water in his room? Sir, I need you to think very carefully. Did you shake hands with anyone who was coughing?" Every answer, every scrap of information, was another piece of the puzzle, another box filled in on the enormous chart. Rosenthal stood in the center of it all, a general directing his troops, his eyes constantly scanning the grid, hunting for a single elusive variable, a common thread that would connect all the victims and expose the killer in their midst. While Rosenthal's team hunted the killer's trail in Philadelphia, Dr. Sarah Bell was trying to capture the killer itself, 400 miles away in a high-security biocontainment lab at the CDC in Atlanta. She was a brilliant microbiologist, a specialist in cultivating rare and dangerous bacteria. Before her, on sterile steel trays, were dozens of petri dishes containing small, grim samples of lung tissue, flown in that morning from the first autopsies. Working late into the night under the harsh, sterile glow of the lab's fluorescent lights, she began her work. The enemy was almost certainly a bacterium, but what kind? One that thrived in high-sugar environments, one that needed a specific amino acid, one that could only grow in the absence of oxygen. She didn't know, so she had to try everything. With painstaking care, she streaked the lung samples onto dozens of different agar plates. There were blood agar plates, chocolate agar plates, nutrient-rich broths, and selective media designed to grow only the most finicky of organisms. It was a systematic, exhaustive attempt to offer the unknown pathogen a home, a meal, a place to grow and reveal itself. She placed the dishes in incubators and waited. 24 hours, 48 hours, 72 hours. Each day, she would pull the trays out, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and dread. And each day, she was met with the same sterile, gut-wrenching silence. The plates were clean. Not a single visible colony of bacteria grew on any of them. It was as if the lung tissue was sterile, which was impossible. The killer was there. She had seen it under the microscope in the tissue samples. But it refused to grow. It refused to be captured. The failure of every standard laboratory technique was terrifying. It meant they were facing something new, something that didn't play by the known rules. A new, unkillable virus. A deadly chemical poison. Or a bacterium so alien it couldn't live in any of their carefully prepared worlds. The pressure from the public and the media was becoming unbearable. The story was now on the front page of every newspaper in the country. The Philly killer, the Legionnaire plague. Frank D'Amico, the state health official, decided he could wait no longer. Against Rosenthal's strenuous advice, he called a press conference. Rosenthal stood at the back of the crowded, chaotic room as D'Amico stepped up to a bank of microphones. "We are exploring every possibility," D'Amico said, his voice straining to sound confident. "While the investigation is ongoing, preliminary signs suggest we may be dealing with a new, virulent strain of swine flu." A shockwave went through the room. Reporters began shouting questions. Swine flu had been the subject of a massive, panicked national vaccination campaign earlier that year. The suggestion that it was back, in a new and deadly form, was like throwing gasoline on a fire. Rosenthal closed his eyes, his fists clenched in fury. D'Amico had no evidence to suggest swine flu. He was speculating, throwing out a familiar name to give a frightened public a familiar enemy. It was a political move, an attempt to look like he was in control, but it was terrible science. It would create a new wave of hysteria and send local doctors chasing the wrong diagnosis. The cautious, evidence-based search for the truth had just been sacrificed for the sake of a reassuring but utterly baseless soundbite. It was past midnight in the war room. The building was quiet, but Rosenthal's team was still at work, fueled by stale coffee and a grim sense of urgency. The line listing chart now contained data from over 150 confirmed cases. It was a monumental testament to their work, but it had so far revealed nothing. The victims had eaten different foods, drank different drinks, met different people. The killer S-trail was a tangled, incomprehensible mess. A young epidemiologist named Mark, his eyes red and raw from staring at the chart for the past 18 hours, was tracing his finger down a column he had created himself, labeled Location. He was comparing the victims' movements on each day of the convention. Suddenly, he stopped. He traced the line again, his finger moving faster now. He grabbed a red marker and began to circle names, his movements quick and excited. "Dr. Rosenthal," he said, his voice cracking with exhaustion and excitement. "Dr. Rosenthal, I think I've found it." Rosenthal rushed to his side. Mark pointed a shaking finger at the sea of red circles on the chart. "Look," he said. "They didn't all eat the same thing. They didn't all drink the same thing, but they were all in the same place. Of the 150 confirmed cases, 142 of them either stayed at the Bellevue-Stratford Hotel or attended an event in the lobby, or, in 3 cases, just walked past the main entrance on the sidewalk outside." The words hung in the air. It was the breakthrough. A single, undeniable statistical spike. The methodical, tireless, frustrating hunt for a pattern had paid off. They didn't know what the killer was, but after days of searching in the dark, they finally knew where it lived. The statistical spike was a beacon in the fog. For Dr. David Rosenthal, the data was undeniable. The Bellevue-Stratford Hotel was not just a common link, it was ground zero. The nature of the investigation changed overnight. It was no longer a sprawling hunt across a city, tracking the movements of men. It was now a focused forensic autopsy of a single massive building. The hotel, once a symbol of Philadelphia's opulence and civic pride, became a place of fear. Police barricades kept back the crowds of reporters and nervous onlookers. The grand entrance, usually bustling with guests and doormen, was now sealed with yellow tape. Rosenthal and his team, clad in early-generation protective gear that looked like something out of a science fiction movie, unsealed the doors and stepped into the silent, cavernous lobby. The crystal chandeliers still hung from the ornate ceiling, but they now illuminated a scene of eerie abandonment. The investigation had turned inward. They were no longer hunting a contagion on the move. They were entering the killer's lair. The scale had shifted from the macroscopic to the microscopic, from tracking people to hunting a pathogen in its native environment. The search was a masterpiece of methodical, scientific rigor. For 3 days, Rosenthal's team swarmed through the silent, opulent hotel. They moved from room to room, floor to floor, their actions a quiet, focused ballet of evidence collection. They swabbed every surface that hands could have touched: doorknobs, elevator buttons, the polished wood of the front desk. They took samples from the water taps in every bathroom, from the ice machines on every floor. They disassembled the plumbing, scraped samples from the drains, and tested the residue in the water pitchers. In the hotel's vast kitchens, they swabbed every cutting board, every refrigerator handle, every serving spoon. They took samples of the food still sitting in the walk-in coolers. In the guest rooms, they cut swatches from the thick carpets and the heavy velvet curtains. Every conceivable source of infection, every possible hiding place for the invisible killer, was sampled, bagged, labeled, and sent to a mobile lab they had set up in a truck outside. The work was exhaustive, meticulous, and ultimately crushingly fruitless. The initial reports began to come back, each one a small death to the team's growing hope. Negative, negative, negative. The water was clean, the food was clean, the ice was clean, the surfaces were clean. They were standing in the heart of the outbreak, the place where the data screamed the killer lived, and yet they could find no trace of it. The frustration was immense. The killer was still invisible. Back in the sterile silence of her lab in Atlanta, Dr. Sarah Bell was facing her own wall of failures. The killer refused to grow. Every nutrient-rich plate, every carefully prepared broth, remained stubbornly clean. It was, she thought, like trying to grow a creature from another planet in earthly soil. Desperate, she went back to the source, the autopsy reports. She stared for hours at the microphotographs of the victim's lung tissue, looking for a clue she might have missed. And then she saw it. A small, seemingly insignificant detail. In several of the samples, the mysterious rod-shaped bacteria were not alone. They were clustered near, and in some cases, inside, much larger, single-celled organisms, amoebas. It was a common finding. Waterborne amoebas often contained bacteria. But what if it wasn't a coincidence? What if the killer didn't just live near the amoebas? What if it needed them to survive? On a hunch, a spark of creative desperation, she decided to try a radical new approach. She abandoned the sterile, artificial world of the agar plate. Instead, she took a culture of living cells, yolk sacs from chicken eggs, and created a medium that mimicked the rich, nutrient-filled internal environment of an amoeba. It was a long shot, a technique almost unheard of for isolating an unknown bacterium, but all the standard methods had failed. She had to try something new. She carefully introduced a sample of the lung tissue into her new living culture, placed it in the incubator, and began the long wait, hoping she had finally offered the invisible killer a home it could not refuse. Night fell on Philadelphia. David Rosenthal stood alone in the center of the Bellevue-Stratford grand empty lobby. The silence was absolute, a heavy, oppressive blanket. The investigation was stalled. Every sample taken from the hotel had come back negative. The killer had left no tracks. Outside, the media frenzy was growing more intense. Inside, his team was exhausted and demoralized. He could feel the pressure from Washington, the impatience from the media, the quiet accusation from the families of the dead. He had followed the data, and it had led him here, to this grand, gilded dead end. He looked up at the vaulted ceilings, at the ghosts of 1,000 parties and celebrations. He felt the immense weight of the dozens of lives that had been lost, the dozens more that were still in the balance, all depending on him to find a killer he could not see, could not grow, could not find. For the first time, a sliver of profound doubt entered his mind. What if the statistical spike was a fluke, a bizarre coincidence in the data that meant nothing? What if they were wrong about the hotel all along? He had bet everything on the cold, hard logic of his science, and his science had failed him. In the silent, empty heart of the outbreak, Dr. David Rosenthal felt a crushing, terrifying sense of defeat. The killer, it seemed, was going to win. Dr. David Rosenthal walked out of the gilded cage of the Bellevue-Stratford Hotel and into the thick, soupy air of a Philadelphia summer night. The investigation was officially stalled, defeated. He had followed the science, and the science had led him to a dead end. He walked aimlessly down the sidewalk, the streetlights casting long, distorted shadows, his mind replaying the endless, frustrating data points, the deaths, the failed tests, the political pressure. It was a hot, humid night, the kind where the air itself feels heavy and wet. And then, he felt it. A fine, cool mist on his face and arms. It was a welcome, momentary relief from the oppressive heat. He stopped, wiping the moisture from his brow. He looked around. It wasn't raining. The mist was localized, drifting down from above. He tilted his head back and looked up at the immense, ornate facade of the hotel. High above, near the roofline, a massive industrial unit was churning away, a plume of white water vapor billowing from its vents into the night sky. The hotel's cooling tower, the heart of its massive air conditioning system. And in that instant, a thought sparked in his mind, an idea so sudden, so shocking in its simple, elegant logic, that it was like a physical jolt, the data reconfigured in his mind. The victims who never went inside the hotel, the ones who just walked past on the sidewalk. They were the anomaly he could never explain. The mist, the air itself. He had been looking for a killer inside the hotel, but what if the killer was on the roof, breathing its poison down on everyone below? Rosenthal was a man possessed. He sprinted back to his own hotel room, his mind racing. He grabbed a notepad from the desk and began to sketch, his hand moving with a frantic, desperate energy. He wasn't a mechanical engineer, but he understood the basic principles. He drew a diagram of the hotel's massive air conditioning system. It was a closed loop, but one part of it was open to the world, the cooling tower. It used water to cool the refrigerant, and in the process, the water became warm. To dissipate the heat, the tower vented the water as a fine, aerosolized mist. The mist he had felt on his face wasn't just clean water. It was water that had been circulating through the building's plumbing. The system was a giant atomizer, a massive building-sized perfume bottle, sucking in water from one place and spraying it as a microscopic breathable mist out over the roof, into the air intakes, and onto the street below. He stared at his frantic drawing. It explained everything. It explained how the Legionnaires staying in the hotel got sick. It explained how people in the lobby got sick, and it explained how the man who just walked down the street for a hot dog got sick. They had all been breathing the same air that was being humidified by the same contaminated water source. He finally had it, a single, coherent, and terrifyingly plausible hypothesis. The next morning, the CDC team moved with a renewed, electric sense of purpose. The despair of the previous night was gone, replaced by the focused thrill of the hunt. They weren't swabbing doorknobs anymore. They were going to the source. They ascended to the roof of the Bellevue-Stratford, a grimy industrial landscape of pipes and vents, a world away from the opulent lobby below. Following Rosenthal's lead, they located the access panel for the main cooling tower. It was a massive, squat, metal structure, humming with power. With a groan of rusted metal, they pulled the panel open. The stench that rolled out was immediate and foul, the smell of rot and decay. Inside was a large basin filled with a pool of warm, stagnant, murky water. A thick, greenish-brown slime coated the sides of the tank. It was a perfect incubator, a stagnant, lukewarm paradise for any microbe that happened to find its way inside. This was it. This had to be it. Working with grim determination, they carefully took multiple samples of the foul water and scraped the thick slime from the inside of the tank into sterile containers. At the exact moment Rosenthal's team was sealing the samples on the hotel roof in Philadelphia, Dr. Sarah Bell was standing before an incubator in her lab in Atlanta. She was preparing to discard her failed experiment. For weeks, the special culture plate, the one using living cells to mimic the inside of an amoeba, had remained stubbornly clean. It was her last best hope, and it had yielded nothing. With a sigh of frustration, she opened the incubator to retrieve it for sterilization. But then she stopped. She blinked, leaning closer. Was that? It couldn't be. On the surface of the culture, a place that had been perfectly clear yesterday, were now faint, shimmering, opalescent patches. They looked like tiny drops of oil on water. Her heart began to pound. With hands that were suddenly trembling, she placed the culture plate under a microscope and looked into the eyepiece. For a moment, there was nothing. Then she adjusted the focus, and the image snapped into view, and she gasped. The shimmering colonies were made up of millions of tiny, rod-shaped organisms, squirming and moving in the microscopic field of view. It was a bacterium, a life form she had never seen before. A life form no one had ever seen before. After weeks of searching in the dark, she was the first human being in history to lay eyes on the Philadelphia killer. She had it. She had isolated it. Dr. David Rosenthal stood in the chaotic Philadelphia war room, the phone pressed hard against his ear. The connection to Atlanta was crackly, but Dr. Sarah Bell's voice was clear, sharp, and ringing with the pure, unadulterated thrill of discovery. "I have it, David," she said, her words tumbling out. "It's growing. A gram-negative rod, unlike anything I've ever seen. I've isolated the killer." A wave of relief so profound it was almost dizzying washed over Rosenthal. After weeks of dead ends and despair, they had the pathogen. As Bell excitedly described the bacterium's unique characteristics, a CDC courier, who had just arrived on a chartered flight from Philadelphia, rushed into her Atlanta lab. He was carrying a refrigerated container with the samples taken that morning from the Bellevue-Stratford cooling tower. "The water samples are here," Bell said to Rosenthal, her voice now tight with anticipation. The final piece of the puzzle. Her team immediately sprang into action. They had spent the last few hours developing a new, experimental test. Using antibodies from the blood of infected guinea pigs, they had created a fluorescent stain, a dye that would stick only to the unknown bacterium and glow a brilliant green under ultraviolet light. It was a microscopic flare gun, designed to illuminate a single, specific target. The tense race to connect the pathogen to the source had begun. The final test was deceptively simple. Dr. Sarah Bell, her hands steady, prepared a slide with a single drop of the murky water from the hotel's cooling tower. In the quiet, darkened microscope room, she applied the fluorescent antibody stain, a clear liquid that held the key to the entire mystery. She slid the sample onto the microscope stage, took a deep, steadying breath, and looked into the eyepiece. For a moment, there was only darkness. Then, she switched on the ultraviolet light, and she gasped. The entire field of view exploded in a brilliant, eerie green. It was a galaxy of light, a teeming, swirling cosmos of millions of the exact same, previously unknown bacteria she had so painstakingly cultured from the victim's lungs. They were there. They had been there all along. It was a perfect, undeniable match. She reached for the phone, her voice shaking, not with fear, but with the sheer, overwhelming weight of the discovery. "We have it, David," she said, the words catching in her throat. "It is a perfect match. The tower is the source, the water, the slime it's teeming with it. We have it." In Atlanta, a microbiologist had given the killer a face. In Philadelphia, an epidemiologist now had its address. The invisible enemy, after weeks of terror, was finally visible. The hunt was over. Days later, Dr. David Rosenthal stood before a massive bank of cameras and reporters in a packed Philadelphia conference room. The atmosphere was no longer one of panic and hysteria, but of rapt attention. Flanked by a quiet and visibly humbled Frank D'Amico, Rosenthal calmly and clearly laid out the findings of the CDC's exhaustive investigation. He spoke not of a Philly killer or a mysterious plague, but of science. He explained the methodical detective work, the frustrating dead ends, and the final crucial breakthroughs in both the field and the lab. He announced to the world the discovery of a new family of bacteria, an organism previously unknown to science. In honor of the victims, he said, they were naming it Legionella pneumophila, and the disease it caused would be known as Legionnaire's disease. He explained how this remarkable organism thrived in warm, stagnant water, and how the modern invention of the air conditioning tower had created the perfect environment for it to grow and the perfect weapon to spread it, aerosolizing it into a fine, breathable mist. The fear that had gripped the nation began to recede, replaced by the calm of a rational, scientific explanation. New public health guidelines for the maintenance of cooling systems would be issued. The mystery was solved. Months later, Rosenthal was visiting Bell in her lab in Atlanta. They stood together before a large monitor which displayed a highly magnified, colorized electron microscope image of the Legionella bacterium. Rendered in false color, it looked alien and strangely beautiful, a complex structure of membranes and flagella. "It was there all along," Bell said quietly, her voice filled with a scientist's awe. "In ponds, in streams, for millions of years. Just waiting for us to build the perfect home for it." Rosenthal nodded, staring at the image of the organism that had consumed his life for nearly 6 months. They hadn't vanquished a monster. They had just been formally introduced to a previously unknown neighbor in the vast invisible world of microbes. The victory was not one of war, but of discovery. It was a sober reminder that humanity is not the master of the natural world, but a small part of it, and that the world is full of invisible killers, not born of malice, but simply waiting for the right conditions to emerge and thrive. The story of the first Legionnaire's outbreak is such a classic epidemiological detective story. You have the dedicated scientists, the race against time, and that final, triumphant eureka moment. But when you step back, what's so fascinating is that the villain of the story isn't really the bacterium. In a way, the villain is us, or rather our own ingenuity. The Legionella bacterium had existed harmlessly in ponds and streams for millions of years. It was just another part of the ecosystem. It took the invention of the modern, large-scale air conditioning system, a symbol of progress and comfort, to inadvertently create the perfect weapon. We built the ideal incubator, a warm, stagnant pool of water, and then we attached a system to aerosolize it and pump it directly into the air that people breathe. We created the perfect environment for a predator we didn't even know existed. This story is a powerful lesson in ecological humility. It shows that our greatest strengths, our ability to engineer and control our environment, can create new, unforeseen vulnerabilities. For every problem we solve with technology, we can accidentally create a new one. It's a perfect example of how progress and risk are two sides of the same coin. And it makes me wonder, what modern comforts that we take for granted today might be creating the perfect conditions for the next invisible killer? Let me know what you think in the comments.